last session of the day. I think it was a long day and we had very interesting speeches and sessions. So thank you to Capital and the whole team to do this fantastic job for EAPC. Let's introduce our next speakers to the topic politics in the age of polarization. And we have really two very experienced experts with us, and it's an honor for me as a board member of EAPC and also as the founder to introduce you, these both very experienced experts. I want to start with Mark MELLMAN. Mark is the president of the American Association of Political Consultants, and he is also the head of the MELLMAN Group, one of the leading American public opinion and research companies, and one of the most awarded research firms in the US. So he is very experienced and he did more than 500 campaigns, national and international. So he knows the whole story. And it's also a big honor for me to introduce Professor John Curtice. John Curtice is Professor of Politics at the STRATHCLYDE University of Glasgow, Scotland, and he is Senior Research Fellow at the NetSyn Social Research, Britain's largest independent research institute. So there are two experienced people with us, and we will have very interesting speeches during the next half an hour. So let's start with Mr. Curtice.
Thank you very much. Could somebody tell me how the technology works, please, because I've got slides.
It's okay.
Right, how do I get the slide? Ah, there's a little box. Ah, right. Ah, wonderful. Right, okay. This is aimed primarily at those of you who come from outside the UK, so apologies to those of you who are very familiar, maybe in your view horribly familiar with the debate about Brexit in this country. But as the theme of this session is about polarisation, and given that as I'm going to try to Brexit is indeed a case study in polarisation, albeit a different kind of polarisation from what we're used to, and that's perhaps why we use the word polarisation to describe it, because there's nothing new about polarisation in politics. So I want to tell you a little bit to try and get you to understand the social and demographic, indeed value divisions that underlie the Brexit debate in the UK. So anyway, given that I'm aiming for those of you who don't come from the UK, three things you need to know about this country so far as the Brexit debate is concerned. The first is that a country whose historical experience has predominantly been as a net exporter of population, during the course of the last 15 years or so, has become a net importer of population on a very substantial scale by its own historical standards. And although only around a half of the net migration to the UK comes to the European Union, because the European Union has freedom of movement, and therefore as a result it is impossible for politicians to control the level of migration from within the European Union. This enabled the issue of immigration to be linked to the European Union in the British political debate. So that's point one. Point two is that, of course, the European Union is meant to be an organisation that brings economic well-being, but of course the financial crash of 2008 took its toll on the economies of many an economy, and the UK was certainly no exception. And as you will see, basically, in the 10 years or so running up to the referendum, we were struggling to get average living standards in the UK back up to where they had been before the financial crash. So insofar as the European Union can be portrayed as one of the institutions of international capitalism, which is designed to promote international economic activity, shall we say, this was not necessarily the most auspicious time to persuade people that such institutions were necessarily in everybody's interest. The third thing that you need to understand about this country, and why in a sense it always was the soft underbelly so far as its adherence to the European Union is concerned, is that basically relatively few people in the UK feel European. These are Eurobarometer data, and it's showing, they asked a question which invite people to go from I'm British, not European, to I'm a mixture of the two, to I'm European, not British. And as you can see, consistently around 60% or so of people in the UK say they are British and deny they are European. And in truth, at the moment, the only other country in the European Union which has more than 50% of its population taking that view is Greece. So you have to understand that Europe, for many people in this country, is other. It's not part of us. And therefore, arguments about the legitimacy of our membership of the European Union and the right of Brussels to sometimes tell us what to do was always potentially under question. So those are three things you need to understand. And certainly given the last point, it also follows that the UK's membership of the European Union has, so far it is concerned, been a transactional bargain. And therefore, what was going to be crucial to the outcome of the referendum is how people saw that bargain. Here's one piece of evidence from polling done just literally before polling day. Now, as you can see on a number of items, people are more likely to think that leaving the EU is going to be bad rather than good. That's true, for example, of whether or not impact on the UK's influence in the world, the impact on the UK's economy and on jobs. But you will notice, well, first of all, a feeling that maybe the National Health Service might be better, which is code for we might have better public services because we're not sending money to Brussels, a particular debate in the referendum. But notice on the far right-hand side, well over half of people saying immigration will fall if the UK leaves the European Union. And the truth is, therefore, so far as issue ownership is concerned, the Remain side owned the economy, it owned the question of influence, but notice, even though it owned it, it was always the case that less than half the public were convinced that we would be worse off if we left the European Union. A lot of people just said it won't make any difference. Meanwhile, the Leave side owned the issue of immigration, and together with something that's more difficult to get on these slides, the question of sovereignty. Given that balance, you might be wondering how the result came out as it is. Well, actually, you can do a fairly simple piece of arithmetic in order to see how the UK ends up being pretty much evenly divided on the question of Brexit on polling day. So, this is taken from post-referendum data. So in these data, 25% of people said they thought the UK would be better off leaving the European Union, 35% thought it would make no difference, and 40% thought that we would be worse off. Now, if you're in the first or the third rows, we can guess which way you're going to vote with virtual certainty, i.e. around 90% of people who thought that we will be better off if we left the European Union voted to leave, and conversely 90% of those who thought we were worse off voted to remain. And the economy is a central issue in influencing the way in which people vote. However, notice that in the middle, the 35% of people who said it won't make any difference, they split roughly 2 to 1 in favour of leave. And all I've done for you here is to do the mental arithmetic. So, what is 90% or 25% worth to the leave vote? It's worth 23%. What is 69% of 35% of the vote? It's worth 24%. And then you get a few smidgen of people who are worse off but still voted to leave. And you add those columns up and you get to 50%. So you can see how, on that side of the fence, although the economy is a Remain issue, because of the marginal distributions, it's not strong enough, even though it's a very strong determinant of the way in which people vote. Indeed, it's actually a stronger determinant of the way in which people voted than was actually the issue of immigration. Only 70% of those people who thought that immigration would fall actually voted to leave. But the marginal distribution is much more favourable to the Leave side than is the previous one to the Remain side, and you do the same mental arithmetic and you end up at 50%. So that the transactional perceptions, together with the extent to which they're correlated with vote choice, means you end up with a country that's going to divide pretty much evenly down the middle as the UK did, although in the end the Leave ended up at 52%. But behind these broad headline numbers lies the polarisation. So in one sense, when it's showing you polarisation, polarisation between those who take a very different view about immigration from others, and those who take a different view about the economy. But now look at the demographics of this vote. Division number one, polarisation number one. Older people voted predominantly to leave, younger people voted predominantly to remain. Very, very strong difference. Secondly, educational background was crucial. University graduates, most of them voted to remain, only around 1 in 5 voted to leave. In contrast, those with few of any educational qualifications, around 70% of them are voting to leave. These, by the way, are long known to be demographic correlates of what we can call social liberalism, which I'm going to come on to in a moment. The other polarisation that's going on is between those who regard themselves as part of the UK's ethnic minority community and those who don't. Members of the UK ethnic minority community were much more likely to vote to remain. What mattered less, not completely irrelevant, but mattered much less, is social class. Now, this country is well used to being polarised by social class. It's the classic division of the distinction between Conservative and Labour. So the thing one needs to understand about Brexit is not necessarily that this is polarisation for the first time, as opposed to polarisation around a different set of demographics from what the UK is used to. And what is the content of this division? What are people arguing about? Well, yes, unsurprisingly, if you go through these demographic divisions, they had different views about what they thought the merits or otherwise of leaving the EU would be. So left-hand side is illustrating for you the age difference, the right-hand side is illustrating the difference by education. And yes, younger people and graduates are more likely to think that leaving the EU is going to be disadvantageous. Sorry, that staying in the EU has been good for the UK, and those who are older and those who don't have education qualifications were more likely to think that staying in the EU has not been good for the UK. Reverse the proposition and ask people whether or not leaving the EU is going to make Britain's economy worse or better, and you get the same pattern. Younger voters and graduates are much more likely to think that the UK is going to suffer than are older voters and those with little in the way of educational qualifications. And yes, lo and behold, these groups also differ about the question of free movement. Younger voters, for the most part, are inclined to think that free movement's been good for the UK, certainly more likely to think it's been good than bad. Older voters take a different view, and again, a clear division by education. So these groups differ in their views about the immigration consequences of European Union membership and of leaving. They disagree about the economic consequences. And behind the last division about free movement are very, very different views about the consequences of immigration. Young people are relatively unlikely to think that being in the EU undermines the UK's sense of identity. Older people are much more likely to take that view, and a similar difference between graduates and non-graduates. Now, the truth is that actually, if you go into the academic literature about attitudes towards the European Union, none of this should surprise you. It's long been demonstrated, not just in the UK, that younger people and university graduates are more likely to be in favour of EU membership. Then you have to think about it and you can begin to understand why this polarisation arises. If you're a young university graduate, maybe you speak a second language, you've got high labour market skills, you've got precisely the kind of skills that might well mean that you can indeed profit from freedom of movement. You've got the skills required to work in Barcelona or Berlin or wherever. In contrast, if you're an older worker with little way of educational qualifications, you do not have those labour market skills. All that you fear, at least, is that immigration perhaps reduces your wage rate and certainly changes your country culturally in a way that you are not used to. Remember those immigration figures that I showed you. And indeed, what we can then see, if we then go moving beyond the particular issues of the referendum campaign, to look much more broadly at the values that underlie this referendum division, then one can see something very important and very interesting. First of all, I'm taking here some data from an academic survey in which we ask people a sequence of questions which are essentially about what role do you think the state should play in reducing inequality, or not shouldn't play. And if you're on the left, you're somebody who thinks the state should do a bit more. And if you're on the right, you're somebody who thinks the state should do a bit less. And I basically divided the UK population up into thirds on this dimension. What I'm showing you is the level of support for Remain and Leave, separately for left, centre and right. And yes, the crucial point is that here there is no polarisation. Whether or not you are a left-winger or a right-winger made virtually no difference to your chances of voting for Remain or Leave in the referendum. This was not a referendum in which we were talking about the role of the state in getting more or less inequality. What does divide, and what therefore is the polarisation, but we should be careful using this word. This polarisation surprises people because it's new in our politics, but we should be aware that what happened in the EU referendum is that simply a traditional source of polarisation became less important, and a new one became more important. But whether or not we're more polarised, we're differently polarised, I would argue, is the crucial point. Anyway, here I'm dividing the UK population up in the same way, using some questions that divide the country between those who are social liberals and those who are social conservatives. Social liberals are people who say, look, at the end of the day, what moral code you live up to is up to you. What mores you follow, up to you. What religion you have is up to you. What language you speak is up to you. In other words, what symbols you follow, what flag you think you should follow. This is essentially up to you. We live in a multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-religious society. Social conservatives, in contrast, say, well, hang on, actually, for society to cohere to a reasonable degree, you have to have a degree of social cohesion, therefore to a degree of common social morality, etc., etc. That's the division that the Brexit divide was about. As you can see, around 80% of those who are social liberals voted to remain, and around 3/4 of social conservatives voted to leave. So the Brexit referendum introduced a different polarisation to our politics. It's one, however, that I haven't got time to show you now, then went on to have its influence on the 2017 general election that we had last year. So, Brexit uncovered a major social division. It isn't unique to Britain. It can be found elsewhere in Europe. Indeed, it can be found in the United States, I suspect somebody will argue. But it had a particular resonance here because of the backdrop that I showed you about the history of this country and its sense of identity. It's a division between young and old, between graduates and those with less than qualifications, and to some degree with those between migrants and non-migrants. It reflects differences of values and of perceived interest. You will fail to understand the Brexit divide unless you understand that different people in different sections of British society have different views about where their interests lie vis-a-vis the European Union. This is not something where there's an undifferentiated agreement about what is of interest in this country. People in different demographic situations view the consequences of globalization of the European Union differently. It's just, and this is an important division. It clearly is a clear example of polarization. It just isn't the polarization between left and right that we've been used to within the United Kingdom.
Thank you for this very interesting presentation. We should discuss this presentation as first. I believe that Mark has a different presentation. Do you have questions? This one, please.
So as you said, quite a lot of the divide is due to age as well, and changing degree along there. Do you see that in time, that divide will disappear as that current younger cohort age and it changes, or will there always be that social divide?
There's the $64,000 question to which we do not know the answer. We, of course, should be extremely wary of assuming that those who are liberal today will be liberal tomorrow. Because of course it is the generation of people who voted for the UK to stay inside the then common market back in 1975 that voted heavily to leave this time around. But more broadly, I mean, I can paint you two scenarios. Scenario number one is that this country continues to argue about Brexit, either because it goes pear-shaped or in the end we have a second referendum or whatever. And against that backdrop, this divide is going to continue to matter. In contrast, if Brexit ends up being relatively successful, however one wishes to define that, and in the end, although the fact the country at the moment is still divided down the middle on the subject, there ends up being acceptance that we've found some modus vivendi vis-a-vis our relationship with the European Union that most people can work with, then maybe indeed this divide will become less important. It's the potential for that divide is always there, but the point is it's become politicized as a result of the debate about the Brexit referendum. So it really does, I think, very much depend on what is the history of the Brexit issue in UK politics. And I don't think that's a subject on which anybody wishes to give a prediction at the moment.
So my question somewhat leads on from that one. I'm curious about the specific ways that we measure actual political ideology and polarization. So you mentioned two different measures, one that did not show the polarization along Brexit attitudes and one that did. I'm curious whether or not you think that the one that did along social liberalism and conservatism, if that's something that you think will be an enduring measure in years to come, or is this something that just captures the difference in society right now?
Well, I mean, the answer to is that the distinction between social liberals and social conservatives it's always been there to a degree in British politics. But as it were, more clearly on what we might call the fringes than in the centre. So if you want to identify a Liberal Democrat supporter, so that's the third party that was in the coalition with the Conservatives, which at the moment is not doing too happy, that's a classic social liberal party. It tends to do relatively well amongst university graduates, amongst social liberals, which is why it was a bad idea for them to hike up university tuition fees. It's called knocking your core constituency, never a good idea. On the other side of the spectrum, UKIP, the United Kingdom Independence Party, whose political rise was responsible for the referendum actually happening, it is very predominantly amongst social conservatives. It's not strong amongst right wingers, by the way, it's strong amongst social conservatives. Now, but the crucial point is that so far as our two largest parties are concerned, yes, the Labour Party tends to do somewhat better amongst social liberals, the Conservative Party tends to do somewhat better amongst social conservatives, but that relationship is, in the wake of Brexit, has become much stronger. The left-right divide is still there when it comes to whether you vote Conservative or Labour. It's not disappeared in the broader scheme of British politics, but it's now operating alongside the social liberal versus social conservative dimension, and this creates some very uneasy coalitions in our two largest parties. E.g., the Conservative Party, which is supposedly the party of big business, now has a protectionist electorate of people who want to run the economy in a way that is protected from globalised forces. The Labour Party, which is traditionally the party of the working class and therefore the party of the left, is now dominated by a social liberal electorate. University graduates are almost as likely to vote Labour as are people in working class occupations. So I'll give you some idea of how disruptive, once you've got these two dimensions, being encompassed within what's still only two dominant political parties, two political parties that dominate much more than they did, because ironically both UKIP and the Democrats have formed that.
Thank you. Further more questions? Two questions. Richard.
Do you think that if the previous government, Conservative government, had been less partisan during the referendum and hadn't made a point of Project Fear, that the referendum result might have been different? Either way, it might have been a stronger Leave vote, or it might have been even a Remain vote.
Well, I certainly, for those who certainly may know, I was writing a blog all the way through the EU referendum campaign, it's still out. And I said in the wake, after David Cameron came back from the European Council in February 2016, and it was clear that the public reaction to the so-called renegotiation was, well, is that it? And that therefore we're looking at a close contest. I have no writing blog, but David Cameron now needs to realise he's leader of the opposition. i.e. he was only going to win the referendum if he got enough Labour, Liberal Democrat and SNP supporters to vote to remain. But you're right, the way in which the campaign was run did not reflect that crucial cephalological reality. It was essentially being run by David Cameron and George Osborne, the Conservative Prime Minister and Chancellor at the time, and they weren't taking on board the wishes of those who were not of their political persuasion. And they also, they also thought, they came away thinking, getting scientists, for those who not follow British politics, but of course we had another referendum 2 years previously in Scotland about whether or not Scotland should leave the United Kingdom or not. And the no campaign, the campaign to keep Scotland inside the UK, was predominantly a negative campaign. The lesson that Osborne and Cameron drew from the campaign was that negative campaigning worked. Most would say, no, the lesson he drew from that campaign is that negative campaigning didn't work, because although Yes lost the vote, support for Yes increased during the course of the campaign. And that certainly running a Project Fear type campaign, i.e. David Cameron trying to convince voters that that the UK really was going to suffer if it left the European Union, when before the February Council he had been saying, well, actually I haven't made my mind up yet as to which side I'm going to campaign on. I might recommend that we should leave. And given that if we go through the whole of his premiership, he started off as very sceptic, he was not exactly the most convincing voice to persuade people that leaving the European Union was necessarily going to be a disaster, because it was an argument to something that could be challenged out of things that he himself had said in the past. So yes, it's a long-winded way of saying I agree with you. Whether or not, of course, we go different results, it doesn't matter. But certainly the Remain campaign was far too much focused on two politicians who were not able to bring their own voters with them, because the majority of Conservatives voted to leave, and therefore should have tried to run a much wider campaign.
Okay, one last question.
Thank you. I wanted to pick up on your answer to the previous question. One of the comments you made was within the Conservative Party a challenge of protectionist. I want to understand, is that you shorthanding by reference to the decision to leave the European Union, which is one form of trading relationship with a number of countries? Or do you actually believe that? Because one of the observations I would have is that many of those who were on the Brexit side of the Conservative government are championing a very open trading relationship with the rest of the world. So I wouldn't categorise that as protectionism. It's a shift of where they want to focus their trading relationships.
Yeah, but don't confuse the elite level debate with what's going on at the mass level. I'm describing the electorate of the Conservative Party, not the particular perceptions of Liam Fox, the international trade minister. The same division was there in UKIP. I mean, UKIP had its libertarian economic wing, but actually, which is why some things I said earlier, if you actually look at where UKIP voters stand on the left-right spectrum, they're more likely to be on the left than on the right when it comes to the role of the state in managing the economy. So that's why, and they certainly want to control immigration. Yes, they're happy to have free trade, but it's less important. They're looking to the state to protect them from the economic and immigration wings of globalization. This is their principal motivation. And I mean, as I'm guessing you may be interested in the Conservative Party, remember that the Conservative Party has argued about tariff reform on more than one occasion in its life. And this is another echo of the debate about tariff reform. With whom do we or do we not regard as people that we have favourable trade deals with? Who do we regard as our diaspora? It's a long-standing debate in this country which has reared its head once again.
So, thank you for a great presentation and good information. If you have questions, I believe you will stay with us at the end, and so we can have a discussion. Thank you. So, now let's continue the presentation with our next speaker. This is our very good friend of EAPC, Mark MELLMAN from the US.
Thank you very much. Sitting here these last 7 hours, I must say I've gotten the impression this Brexit thing is a pretty big deal here. No, I am an American, but I am not that parochial, stereotypically parochial. I will say I am delighted to be in London on a stereotypically grey day, but I'm really delighted to be here, and I thank the organizers for inviting me. I want to talk about polarization from a very different point of view. Partly I'm going to use a lot of US data. Partly we spell polarization with a Z in the US, so that's another difference. But I'm going to talk about it really sort of conceptually in a different way. What is polarization? What do we mean when we use the word polarization? Well, there's at least 4 definitions, explicit or implicit, that one sees regularly. There are some people, particularly news folks in the United States, who think that any even division is a polarization. That is really not a very good, wise use of the term, but it is a use that's often employed. That is, if it's 50-50, it's polarized. Another definition, more akin to what the term really means, reflects deep division. Deep division. And that means essentially people moving to the extremes in opposite directions. Pew Research Center, with which some of you may be familiar, has its own somewhat idiosyncratic definition of polarization, which is ideological coherence. To what extent do people have consistent political views? That also is a notion of polarization. And finally, there's what we call affective polarization, or really animosity between the parties. All of these are appropriate in some way or other, most of them at least. I want to focus really on the last 3 for the most part. And I want to, first of all, emphasize the difference between deep divisions and even divisions, okay? Because even divisions are not the same thing as deep divisions. Standard upside-down bell curve here, and you can see that this happens to use Democrats and Republicans as the 2 ends, but if you have a lot of people pretty far on one side and a lot of people pretty far on the other, you have a 50-50 situation in this graph, but it is a deep division. On the other hand, if you have a graph that looks like this, where it's also 50-50, but most people are concentrated in the middle, you don't really have deep divisions. You have an even division, but not a deep division. These are conceptually quite different situations. So are we deeply divided? Are voters moving more to the extremes, as in that first graphic? Well, take one example. This is a question asked by the American National Election Studies over the course of many years that basically says the government should provide resources and services for people to achieve things, or really people should rely on themselves. And it's a 7-point scale. Sorry, wrong. This is not. Government should provide fewer services. Government should provide more services. The 7-point scale, you can array yourself anywhere in between. And as you can see, most people are concentrated in the middle. It is that classic bell curve with the largest number in the middle, smaller numbers at the extremes. And really it was the same, almost exactly the same, when this question was first asked in 1996. So again, no real change, and certainly not what we would call polarization. There are, however, big differences between Democrats and Republicans, between the parties themselves. So Democrats move to the left of that line, Republicans to the right, but as you can see, there's still a good deal of overlap in the middle. So here's the question about the government should see to it that people have jobs and a good standard of living versus everybody should get ahead on their own, sort of self-reliance. And here you see a somewhat different pattern. People are saying, more likely to say that people should get ahead on their own, as opposed to saying that the government should see to it that they have jobs and a good standard of living. That's just the American prejudice, if you will. But you can see also that relatively few people are at the extremes. Most people are concentrated in the middle. It's just the whole graph is sort of moved over to the right in this case. Maybe not the way you're facing it, but ideologically to the right. Again, the differences are really that is the differences really do reflect partisanship. That is, Republicans much more to the right, Democrats much more to the left. But as you can see, a lot of the Democrats are sort of in the middle on this as well, fewer of the Republicans. And on health care, we've seen some increase in extreme views. Government insurance plan versus private insurance. We've seen some growth in the number of people saying that they favor a government plan. But again, you can see while there are some people at the extremes, at both extremes, the largest number of people is still in the middle on this particular question. Again, big differences by partisanship, by party, with Republicans overwhelmingly putting themselves on the right of this question, Democrats overwhelmingly putting themselves on the left, though again, a number of Democrats putting themselves toward the middle. So what we've seen over time is really a sorting. That is, we used to have liberal Republicans and conservative Democrats in America. That's really no longer the case. The parties have become ideologically much more consistent. And that's reinforced by separate living and separate thinking. So people of different attitudes don't even live together anymore in the United States. And you look at the preferences that people express for what kind of place they want to live in. Republicans, overwhelmingly, by 2-to-1, say they want to live in places with larger houses that are further apart, schools, restaurants, stores miles away. Democrats overwhelmingly want to, by the same almost 2-to-1 margin, say they want to live in smaller houses closer together that are walkable to schools, stores, and restaurants. So you have people that are actually living differently. And I'm sure Bruce showed you the way that Democrats live in the United States. You'll see the big difference between Democrats and Republicans is in the map. There's a few big blue dots, urban areas, and a lot of smaller red all across the country. Because Democrats tend to live together, Republicans live, well, less together, but everywhere the Democrats don't live. There's also some fundamental differences in the way these people think, each of these groups think. I must say, I first was introduced to this notion of people thinking that differently many years ago when I was visiting this country with someone I don't know anymore, but we were in the Cotswolds, and we sat down to talk with a guy who was, ran an inn, and he explained to us that we Americans really were not in as psychologically good position as the British people. And he explained the reason for this is because we're always trying to get ahead, we're always trying to better ourselves, and it forces us to focus on constant improvement, constant success, achievement. And in Britain, everybody knows their place. Nobody wants to get out of their place. Everybody just wants to keep doing what they're doing the way they've been doing it. They know their place and they stay there. This was so antithetical to the way Americans think about things. It may or may not be representative of the way Britons think about things, but the reality is, struck me, there are very different modes of thought among different people. And indeed, we've documented, not just we, the larger world, academic community has documented lots of differences around the world in the way liberals and conservatives think. You could substitute progressives, left, right, however you want to define those differences. But liberals like change, embrace change. Conservatives prefer tradition. Liberals are committed to social justice. Conservatives focus on social order. Liberals focus on autonomy. We should be able to do what we want. Okay. Conservatives focus on authority. There is a higher authority that tells us what we should do, and we ought to adhere to that authority. Liberals tend to focus on progress and reform. Conservatives on stability and order. Liberals are sensitive to harm, to people to whom harm is being done. They're sensitive to caring for other people. Conservatives sensitivity to purity, that is to keep things pure. Won't bother to get into that, but it's an interesting psychological difference. Liberals tend to embrace and really celebrate, in the case of Democrats, diversity. Conservatives focus on national unity. Big difference. Pluralist decision-making is what liberals focus on. Liberals tend to believe if you get a bunch of people together of different views sitting around the table, they're going to come up with a better idea by virtue of the different opinions that are reflected at the table. Conservatives tend to see a Manichaean process of decision. That is to say, they see good and evil. The way I want to do things is good. The way other people want to do it is evil. And we can't really compromise very much between good and evil. And finally, liberals tend to rely on expert judgment. Conservatives tend to rely on what they think of as common sense. So not only are people living differently, living in different places, they're also thinking in different ways about the world in which they live. So this sorting has led to increased consistency and coherence. So Pew, as I said, tends to measure polarization in a sort of idiosyncratic way. They think about it in terms of consistency. And what you see here is a graph about the number of people that are consistent liberals, consistent conservatives, or mixed. And the main lesson here, of course, is that between 1994 and 2014, you had the two parties moving apart. That is to say, in 1994, you had most Democrats and most Republicans had mixed views ideologically. By 2014, median Republican was pretty consistently conservative. The median Democrat was pretty consistently liberal. So moved apart. This doesn't mean that attitudes have changed at all in the aggregate. It does mean that the parties have become more coherent. The parties have become more consistent. People who are Democrats tend to be more consistently liberal than they were. People who are Republicans tend to be more consistently conservative than they were. And that's an even bigger gulf among those who are politically active. So if you look at the people who are engaged in politics, who do work, who volunteer, who write letters, who give money, that change, that separation, has been even more dramatic than it was among the general population. It's also true in Congress. Hard to explain these, but easy to visualize. 1989, United States Congress, the overlap there is the extent to which people are voting the same way. Democrats and Republicans are voting the same way. And as you can see on a lot of things, even then in 1989, Democrats and Republicans voted differently, but there's a lot of sort of purplish, there's a lot of sort of darker red and darker blue that reflect people voting, people from opposite parties voting the same way on legislation. And you see by the time we get to 2013, there's almost a complete separation. Almost a complete separation between Democrats and Republicans. Very little overlap in the way that they're voting. This is data from the US Senate, but it's the same basic point over a longer time scale, where you can see the sort of density of the pieces in the middle and the distance apart here reflects the extent to which people are voting with each other. Senators are voting with each other. And the extent that they're far apart is relatively little in the middle, it means they are voting quite differently. And as you can see, through the 70s, there was a lot of overlap. As we got to the 90s, and more recently, we've seen the gap widen, and we've seen very little crossover voting in Congress. So what happens here is that citizens and leaders see the same people with them very consistently, and the same people consistently against them. When I first went to Washington some years ago, the fundamental lesson that was being taught then was there are no permanent friends, there are no permanent enemies. On this issue today, this person might be with you. On that issue tomorrow, they're going to be against you, and vice versa. Flexibility, what political scientists love to call cross-cutting cleavages. The reality is people did have different views on different things, and so you could have some Democrats and some Republicans uniting on one issue. You could have a different set of Republicans and Democrats uniting on another issue. There was this kind of variation. As you saw, that is no longer the case. And the end result is that people see themselves on one side or the other consistently, and the trench between the two becomes deeper and deeper. As people consistently see the same people shoulder to shoulder with them, the same people across the way consistently against them, the trench between them, the gap, becomes a chasm. And that's what's happened. People have become more hostile to each other. So we see this affective polarization. So in 1994, 16% of Democrats had a very unfavorable view of the Republican Party. By 2017, 44% of Democrats had a very unfavorable view of the Republican Party, and overall unfavorables went from 57 to 81. And you see the same thing is true among Republicans. They were 17% Republicans had a very unfavorable view of the Democratic Party, up to 45% very unfavorable in 2017. Even when it comes to marriage, we see this animosity developing. So in 1958, the question was asked whether if you had a daughter, you would be upset if your daughter married someone of the opposite party. And in 1958, 33% of strong Democrats said yes, they'd be upset if their daughter married a Republican. 25% of strong Republicans said they'd be upset if their daughter married a Democrat. Look what happened in the ensuing years. By 2016, 60% of strong Democrats, 63% of strong Republicans say they would be upset if their daughter married somebody of the opposite party, assuming they have a daughter. So again, you see in all kinds of ways, we can multiply these, whether it has to do with giving college scholarships, whether it has to do with marriage, all kinds of ways in which the animosity between the parties has increased. The level of animosity might be illustrated by the comment that the former Speaker of the House, John Boehner, made to Democratic leader, then Senate Democratic leader Harry Reid, after a meeting that they had together with the President in the Oval Office. Boehner to Reid, "Go fuck yourself." Okay, this is the level of animosity that we have in the United States Congress, that the leader of one house is saying to the leader of the other, so what they're saying. And that reflects a really significant level of animosity. So before I close, let me just say this is not a uniquely American phenomenon. Look at Israel, which tonight we may know is having another election or not, very near future. But if you look at people who support Benjamin Netanyahu's party, they have an overwhelmingly favorable view of him. They have an overwhelmingly unfavorable view of Yair Lapid, who is his major competitor. If you look at Albania, people who supported the Democratic Party had an extremely unfavorable view of the Socialist Party, 80% unfavorable, 52% very unfavorable, and people who supported the Democratic Party had an equally unfavorable view of the Socialist Party. So again, this kind of affective polarization evident around the world. I could bring you more data from more countries, and it all says the same thing, which is to say, most of it says the same thing, people in different parties really increasingly, intensely dislike each other. So what does that leave us today? It leaves us with neighborly discourse, show some civility as they bash each other over the head. So just to conclude, partisan sorting creates consistency as people join a party that's ideologically related to them. That consistency creates animosity. That animosity is reinforced